So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Chandran Nair. It is quite an honor for us to get Chandran to do this session for us. Chandran is the founder of the Pan-Asia think tank, Global Institute for Tomorrow, GIFT, GIFT for short. Is a member of various leading international organizations, such as the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Governance for Sustainability, and member of Club of Rome, another global platform of diverse thought leaders from past politicians, academics, and business leaders. So Chandran has been invited regularly by leading global business schools as a guest lecturer, including INSEAD, Duke, London Business School, and Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. He's very passionate and visionary about topics around environmental sustainabilities, economics, and social development. Extremely insightful and publishes in books and articles with Financial Times and New York Times, and has also been invited onto BBC and Bloomberg and CNN to share his views. So I've had interactions with Chandran since the start of last year, right? When he's in a very playful mode, he can be quite provocative. Yeah, so I've really no idea what is he going to share with us today. So Chandran, what sort of mood are you in, and what would you be sharing with us?
Can you all see me?
Yes, you can.
All right. Good day, and EK, thank you very much. I'm always in a positive mood. Let me put it that way. Positive, yet with a sense of urgency, sometimes mixed with the sense of joy, anger, but directed towards positive outcomes. So that's a short answer to your question. So thank you very much for having me. What I'm going to try and do is share some thoughts. But first, to everyone here, thank you for having me. I can't claim to be as learned as any one of you in this particular field, but I do have some thoughts. And sometimes, as you all know better than I do, it's always good to have someone from outside the family to come and ask you to look at the front door and see what's in it. So let me try and do that. So, Iki, you started by, for those who don't know the organization, describing some of it. And clearly, I don't know the organization that well, but I did some research to find out. And I learned about, what you call the tea table, etc. But what I was really interested is in what provoked or what triggered the start of the organization. My understanding that the founders, Kurt Lewins, etc., were actually organizing thought leadership workshops, etc., particularly around the premise at that time, post Second World War, around this idea in the West, and I want to emphasize the idea in the West, not in the world, given that the West had been engulfed in a war in Europe, with which then the USA got involved. And I believe Kurt was a German Jew who moved to the USA. Right. Am I right? Yes.
Yes, that's right.
And so correctly and rightly, he was very concerned and absorbed with the idea of democracy versus authoritarianism. And I believe it was out of the genesis of some of that work, this idea of how little groups think, etc. So when I read that, I was rather intrigued by the idea that, and I read from your website that culturally, apparently the world stood in the aftermath of a great struggle between totalitarianism and democracy. I would say that the world actually was not divided around totalitarianism and democracy in the way that the West viewed it. Many of the so-called democracies in the West, let's take the British Empire, were anything but democracies. They were totalitarian regimes, in as far as they continue to oppress millions around the world in the colonies. So these are essentially unclear wording used, and this is what I'm trying to come to, about how subterfuge, intellectual dishonesty is often used to camouflage the way we understand the world. So when I hear of people talk about great democracies and about the threat that totalitarian governments apparently had towards democracies in the West in that period, I'm wondering, which democracies are you talking about? The British Empire at that time was anything but a democracy. The United States of America was anything but a democracy. It was white settlers who had conquered a large piece of land, got rid of the natives, not thousands of years ago, but just a few decades ago, and still the black man didn't have a vote. So why do I say that? Not because I'm seeking to politicize this discussion, but life is politics, and we live in a complex world. I was asked by you to expand perspectives. I was asked, and I understood the brief of this conference was to expand perspectives, provide new ways of thinking, and one of the objectives of the NTL was transformative thinking and learning as well. And I do believe that we live in an era. I do believe we live in an era of great intellectual dishonesty. What passes on for learning is often dumbing down because of the fear of the ability to say anything. And you asked me to, kindly to connect the external and the internal. So the external is what I'm going to be focused on. And there's two areas that I want to focus on. One is, of course, the world we live in, which is riddled with conflict and in grave danger of exploding into something uncontrollable. And that's the tensions in the wars and the tensions between what I call, and some might disagree with me, the inability of a rich, formerly powerful Western world to adopt to a more plural world in which others are rising. At this instance, the Chinese particularly. The inability of the Western powers to give up hegemony, and I will mention what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in Ukraine, and then tied to that is the second great threat of our times, which is what you alluded to, is an area that I know a little about, which is the dangers of the existential threats we face, which are already upon us, and of which climate, biodiversity loss, artificial intelligence, the spread of pandemics are part and parcel of that, all born out of the disregard of human beings for constraints and limits and being able to live within constraints. So connecting between boundaries, etc., requires us to think extremely differently. Changing the world through transformative learning requires us to engage in a very disruptive narrative. Many of us, and I say this very carefully, but also respectively, have mind capture. When we think about things like behavioral science, we only think of the body of work coming from the Western canon. When we think of philosophy, we think of Greek philosophy. We do not think. We think the rest of the world is in darkness. We do not understand or appreciate because we are captive to, and because we are global citizens, particularly those of us who are not from the Western world, we are open to all. We may come from a Chinese tradition. We may come from an Indian, Hindu, Muslim tradition, but those become secondary to essentially the dominant narrative of Western philosophy, as if philosophy doesn't exist in other civilizations. And this is terribly damaging. It's impoverishing. I was talking to a poet yesterday who said to me that, because I'm very intrigued by this subject, but I haven't had enough time to study it. But of course, I've thought about it, but I'm not a scholar, about the comparative nature of philosophy. If you read any book in the Western canon, it all starts with the Western philosophers, starts with the Greeks and ends with sort of modern philosophy, where they quote European philosophers and some of the more modern American philosophers. But they never have in-depth analysis of philosophy from other parts of the world. You would think that no one wrote anything, no one was thinking. And I tried reminding people that somewhere I had the opportunity once to go to Ulaanbaatar several times, in fact, and someone took me to the National Museum of Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia and to the basement. In that basement of the Mongolian National Museum are 1 million books written in Tibetan language, going back hundreds of years, which is a lot about philosophy, ways of life, but we don't understand that. So that's a marker that I put down when we think about these things as well. So move fast forward to the world we live in, and in terms of my role, in terms of trying to conceptualize the world we live in, I've already said that I think the world we live in is one which is in a rather precarious position because of the geopolitical tensions and in terms of the existential threats we face. Both of them are connected in a way because both of them are in a way related to who controls resources and how we use resources. So let me just emphasize a couple of things about, let's just look at what's happened in the last 2 years with the wars in Ukraine and in Gaza. So when we think about transformative thinking, and we think about the way we express ourselves, and particularly the work you do, I would suggest you have two very important clients that you need to go and address. One's the White House, and the other is in Tel Aviv, so that they really understand that it is time to join the 21st century and get with the program, which is the rest of the world is not with them on these barbaric acts, that the future of Western civilization is actually going to be, in my view, determined by the nature of political actions over the next 3-4 years about what's happening with the genocide in Gaza. And how do we deal with these things become very important in the way we think about the context of the world we live in. So I'd like to just talk about a couple of, firstly, when we think about the world we live in, many of us need to be appreciative of the fact that we live in a very telling time. And in my view, I mean by that we live in an age where, for the first time in about 500 years, the Western world is being confronted by the rise of the others. And again, this is not simply a geopolitical discussion. This is a discussion about the nature of civilizational shift. And therefore, how do we have to think very differently? And how do we need to connect beyond boundaries? Boundaries both mental and an understanding of geography and geopolitics. And that end of that 400-500 years of domination is causing the world great pain at the moment. And it'll risk a conflict that perhaps will go out of control and cause great damage. The owners at the moment, in my view, not that there aren't other actors, but the owners at the moment is on the Western world to come to terms with the New World Order. And that New World Order is what I call the post-Western world. So when you start thinking about the world, you have to think about the post-Western world. So whether you're an organizational development expert, whether you're running a foundation, etc., start thinking differently. And this is why I started, and I hope it was not provocative, by saying that the genesis of the NTL, apart from the methodology, was essentially thoughts in the United States in post-Second World War about the fear of democracy being or damaged or essentially losing the battle to what was termed authoritarianism. And I'll go on to cite from your website. After it said that culturally the world stood in the aftermath of a great struggle between totalitarianism and democracy, democracy apparently prevailed. But where? I was the subject of a colony. I had no democracy in Southeast Asia. So democracy prevailed for whom? For the same people who were exploiting the rest of the world. And the decolonization process, it only ended in the 60s, in South Africa in 1990, and in Hong Kong in 1997, in terms of the physical departure of occupying forces, etc. But then it went on to say, democracy prevailed and was valued by social scientists in the US for its alignment with scientific research That's new to me. How on earth did democracy get aligned with scientific research? Look at the state of democracy today. Human development, that's also new to me. And the potential to act for the collective good. That is not necessarily true. And the facts today will bear that out. So I think these are the things I'm really interested in, helping to provoke a conversation about what do we mean by thinking differently and what is transformative thinking. So to contextualize things today, we need to, my point is, we need to understand that the world is in a very, very different place. We're entering a post-Western world. Lose talk about democracy and defining it through the lens of the Anglo-Saxon experience is essentially intellectually dishonest and weak. What is a democracy? What are good governance systems? Second, that the shift of power from the West to the East is long overdue, is inevitable, will take place. How will that happen, and how will this accommodate that? Yesterday, here in Hong Kong, I spoke to one of the oldest transatlantic think tanks, which was created just after the Second World War, and they had their board meeting in Hong Kong for the first time. Many of the board members who come from the US and Europe were in fact worried about coming to Hong Kong, of all places, mainly because of disinformation. And then when they came here, they were shocked. But these are not uninformed people. These are highly educated people. Yet the disinformation. So the creation of the post-Western world has now created great tensions as disinformation about who we are, what we are, how the world looks like, is now a preoccupation of global media too. I know many in the mainstream media, and the disinformation is rabid. So that shift has now created a great shift in what we took as for granted. I was brought up reading the Western media. I don't read it anymore because I can't find anything there that has anything that I can identify as someone who travels extensively finds interesting or even honest. The second thing I'd like to then talk about is, therefore, that's the geopolitical side in terms of the transformations, and therefore also the way we critically examine things and the context of the work we all do. Right here today in Hong Kong is undergoing an economic transformation because the United States, in its supposed great wisdom of promoting democracy all around the world, and its fear of China, has imposed numerous sanctions on China and Hong Kong. And I don't need to talk about what it has done to other countries. But at the same time, as the massacre, genocide, you can call it what you want, is going on in Israel, the Western world is almost silent in not imposing sanctions or calling for action against Israel. You have to wonder why. So that's the geopolitical context. And I leave you with the thought about what does the next 20 years look like as rising powers, China, India, parts of Africa, began to define a new world order. A new world order that will not subscribe to the old world order that essentially the West took for granted, and many of us elites, even from the non-Western world, took for granted because we are captive to the Western narrative. Many of us were educated in that system. Lots of good things in it, but the capture of the mind is the most powerful tool, the most powerful method by which you convince people of how do you separate people and how people begin to think of others as being superior to others. And if you can get people to adopt to your ways, then you essentially have them on your side, and the world becomes a very different place. So that's the first thing. The second one I want to talk about is the world we live in, is the convergence of existential threats. The existential threats we face today, and I will talk about the Asia Pacific region, where I come from, and where what I'm most familiar with, is a region with about 8 billion people. About 4.5 billion people, likely to peak at about 6 billion by 2060. Currently, the existential threats that most people are aware of is loosely called sustainability. It's a lot more than that. On Monday, in the World Economic Forum, will be having its first global One Earth conference in Asia. It's never had a conference dedicated to sustainability. It's called One Earth. I'll be one of the speakers. I'm on the expert panels, etc. But in a way, I am not from the mainstream, and I've challenged them to think very differently. But much of the narrative will be the same. We should all continue to grow. We will find innovations through investments, and we will innovate our way out of the existential threats. If you know a little bit about the science and you're a bit thoughtful and honest, you will know that capital flows and investments in technology are not going to solve this problem at all. And those who work in large organizations are also trapped in this narrative, and very few of us question it. 2 days ago, I met the head of organizational learning and culture, those very fashionable roles in companies called inclusivity, inclusion, and diversity. You all know those ones. Where token agents and others are put in place, but they have to follow dictates that are made out of headquarters to wherever in the world that the headquarters are, by people who have very little understanding of what these terms actually mean. So, and he told me, because he treated me honestly as a brother, and he's from this part of the world, and he said, I find it appalling, but I've got to pay the rent. I've got to continue with this nonsense. And much of it does not recognize what's going on in the real world. So when it comes to talking even about the science that should guide the way we think about existential threats, much of the corporate world and now much of policymakers who have been usurped by management consultants, most of whom have come from the West, into believing in non-scientific approaches. So when it comes to climate science, and I come from a technical background, that doesn't mean I'm very technically smart, but I come from a bioscience background. I have been involved in the environmental sustainability and climate discussions for at least 30 years before it became very fashionable. I have challenged the idea that there is such a thing as net zero. Everyone goes around talking about net zero. And I think our role in society is going forward as professionals. And really the point I'm trying to make here is to be bold, is to question the dishonesty, and to put forth narratives that allow us to build new frameworks of conversations in groups that allow us to then further the cause of injustice, the cause of fighting injustice, and all of that. So I really believe that it's so important that institutions like yours empower its members to be agents of critical thinking. There's too much Kool-Aid out there. The Kool-Aid is powered by so-called academics who write all of those books in the Western canon again. No one's reading a book in Chinese about behavioral science. And if you think there isn't any book written in Chinese or Hindi or other cultures, it's arrogant to assume that these things don't exist or these conversations don't exist. So I think we should be really pluralistic, dig and find out how other societies are dealing with these issues, and bring those into the conversations as well. And I would urge the NTL to actually find some funding to go and look at the body of literature in 2 or 3 different cultures, translate them, and get them distributed to members, so that the enrichment of the intellectual sort of knowledge is shared with many more. Overall, I would say that we live in the 21st century where we have what I call 5 unique features. And Ike, do I have about 5-10 minutes left? Or?
Yes, you do. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I will just say that in the context of what you're thinking about, and then I'm happy to take questions, We need to, I urge you to think about the 21st century as a very unique time in human history. This is usually a long lecture, but I will distill it to about a couple of minutes to say what I think is very important. We live in a century where there are 5 unique features that we will have to contend with. And these are essentially this. For the first time in human history, a population will peak and then decline. This has never happened. But most important part of it is we are living through the exponential curve of the human species exploding in numbers. Between 1980 and 2004, 2024, in the space of 40 years, the human population has doubled. Imagine that it took hundreds of thousands of years for the human population to reach 1 million. So that's the first thing. We are living through that exponential curve. Yet we are using methods of organizing our societies, economic terms that go back to about 200 years ago, devised during an exploitative area of colonization, etc. Free markets come from that. The second one is what I call, of course, is climate change, which we all know. And for the first time in hundreds of thousands, some suggest millions of years, the climate's about to change. Everything's up for grabs. We have to change differently. We have to live differently. Most people don't understand it. I wrote a book around the fact that the crux of the problem is that our economic system is based on furthering relentless consumption. Buy things you don't need with money you don't have. Secondly, and to do that, you have to externalize costs, underprice resources, and essentially underprice the cost of the externalities. Carbon dioxide and climate change is the tip of the iceberg of an economic model that is essentially at war with the planet. The problem, again, is the export of that idea from around the world, from the centers of that model, which is essentially from the West. And of course, the most ardent exporter of that idea over the last 60, 70 years has been the United States. The mass consumption and all of that. In this part of the world, we will not be able to afford that. The idea that 6 million Asians in 2060 can and should aspire to live like Americans and Europeans is a lie. And it's against the laws of physics, entropy, etc. Yet we just carry on. No one's questioning this. And if you work for large organizations, I was talking to someone the other day who's the chairwoman of a very large organization. And you know, they are so uncomfortable talking about curbing consumption. So there is climate, there is population, climate, and then there is essentially the overreach of technology. It's something I can talk about, but I don't mean simply digital technology, but to give you just a little juxtaposition of the rather odd world we live in. And when you think about connecting beyond borders, etc., and people think about technology and digital, today there are more mobile phones in the world than toilets. Think about that. How did the mobile phone become ubiquitous? The technology and the pricing, and the toilet become a luxury item. So I've often argued that we need toilets before mobile phones. We'll build the sewers and the water supply systems to connect cities and people, and then we might bury the fiber optics in the sewer. And then the third point is, of course, the crisis of capitalism, which I connected to the climate change issue, which is the underpricing of consumption, which is the driver of our economy. And a very little understanding of what the economy is for. Again, narratives that come out of the business schools out of the West, which are essentially false premises about how the world ought to operate, and even not based on economic realities. The idea that everyone can have everything is a lie. And lastly, of course, the fact is that we have resource constraints. Resource constraints mean that we, in this part of the world, will not be able to have everything, which then ultimately begs the question, how do you essentially bring justice in terms of social justice to the hundreds of millions of people in the poorer countries who don't have access to the basic rights? Food security, water, sanitation, housing, energy, they have that rights too. In a world where the consumption of the minority with legacy emissions, etc., has already changed the world. This is the debate. But the reality is we will have to find a different way of organizing ourselves. And therefore, we will have to put collective welfare ahead of individual rights, which is the anathema in the so-called democracies. And we will have to put collective over individual so that we can uplift most. And that will be the challenge of our times. So let me finish by saying that those things are the context in which we live in. Those are issues, in my view, drive the big questions of social justice. And for those of you who are interested, I attempted to address those issues in a book I wrote about 2 years ago called Dismantling Global White Privilege, Equity for a Post-Western World. The title is rather provocative, and it was my editor's idea. But the main point of it was to say that when people talk about, and I noticed that the NTL, I went to the website and I looked at calling out racism and calling out hate crimes. How many people have called out large organizations the crime of genocide against Israel in the United States? Everyone's silent, intellectually crippled. If you are for social justice, you call it out now, because history will put you on the wrong side. And people don't understand that essentially the point I was making in my book is that when people talk about social justice, particularly in the United States and Europe, when they talk about racial, it's very easy to call out the Karen. It's very easy to say we liberals are all going to take a knee at a football game. No, no, no. That's a superficial side. Call for more awards for actors at the Oscars and Academies. Who cares? The real issue is, where does white power actually lie in controlling the world? And that's what my book attempted to put. And I argued that white privilege is essentially embedded in the fabric of globalization. It's in the military-industrial complex. It's in business. It's in geopolitics. It's even in the clothes we wear, the books we read, the way our minds are shaped. And so let me stop there and hope that I've added something here to help you connect beyond boundaries by thinking beyond our current mental boundaries, and to essentially look for new narratives and carve your own narratives, because that's what frees us from oppression. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chandran. There's quite a bit of inputs in the chat box. So I think yeah, you are provoking a lot of people to respond or react. So I'd like to invite anybody who has a question to either post your question on the chat box or just raise your hands and just verbalize it. So as you get ready, maybe I'll just start off with one question for Chandran, right? So you talk about how do we empower critical thinking, looking at perspectives differently, transformative thinking. Today we are in a very globalized economy, right? So global supply chains, technology linking everybody up, pop culture, people are traveling all across the world. How is it that we are still so entrenched in our thinking? We are still so easily divided by labels and categories and structures.
Well, I think, it's a very interesting point, and I've been thinking about this a lot. And when we say we, I often wonder who. Those of us who are engaged in this conversation are lucky, but we are a minority. Most parts of the world are not engaged in this conversation. And thank God for that. They're getting on with their lives. They're getting on with doing the things. Many places in the world where there are conflicts, I will be the last to deny that. But many places in the world, people live and work and struggle. What does need to be done is where institutions of their societies need to be better, and that's where we should be working towards, those of us who are elites. So if I look at, the disruptions in the world, and at the moment, and please do not, those of you who come from the United States or Europe, think of me as being anti-Western. A non-Western view is not the same. But today, I think the greatest threat to global peace is the United States and its Western allies. I'm sorry. You can have a problem with China, of course, but China is not instigating war across the world. It's not. So what is it that drives the United States and its military-industrial complex and its politicians to wage war and sanction people? what allows them to believe that they can sanction an ancient civilization like Iran because they deem it to be, whatever it is? No, you can't. So that's something that Americans have to do. So when Americans talk to me, and I was with Americans, from board members, etc., said, "What can we do?" We do what we can in foundations. I said, "You don't do enough because you are all playing it safe." So I think what we need to understand, those of us who are privileged, we are a small minority. We have to go out on a limb. And that's why I do what I do. EK, I came out here. I hope I haven't offended everyone. But I'm not in the business of, I'm not the black and white minstrel show. I didn't come to entertain people. If you don't like it, tough. But I'm respectful of you because I believe that we can have different views, but I don't need to agree with you. And my job is to say, let us think about this a bit more. And if, half this group goes away thinking there was a nugget of what that was said or shared that is worthwhile me taking forward, then I hope I've contributed. So I would answer your question by saying that it's amongst the elites that we are hugely divided, and we provoke more divisions because we believe we are driven by economic interests that force us to do things, whether you're in a company or whether you are in government, etc. Most of the world just wants to get on with their lives, but the only thing depending on the countries they live in and the economic strata, they don't necessarily have the support of the strong institutions, and institutional strength in countries is key to this. And that's how you address societal problems. And the way they are addressed will differ in different countries. And that's why I say to Europeans, can you just butt out of China? It's none of your business. Because China has lifted 700 million people out of poverty. No civilization in human history have done that. And that's not my data, that's the World Bank's data. And if the Chinese people think their leaders need to be changed, let them go and create their own revolution. But to suggest to me that white settlers from other parts of the world care about Chinese and human rights, it's intellectually so bankrupt that I won't not talk about it anymore. But so we have to live with a pluralistic world. We understand there's a different civilization. It's 10,000 years of civilization. We didn't arrive yesterday. The Europeans have a system, good for you. It's shaky, but you have to work it out. I'm not going to come and tell you how to govern your systems, and people have to do that. And if we can help each other, and we think the Chinese system needs improvements, let's go and help them. Let's go and talk to them. But let's not be arrogant, because let's go and help the Americans fix their system if they're open to it.
Yeah. Thanks, Chandran.
Yes. Okay, Edwin Olsen has a question. He has raised his hand. Can you please invite him?
Yeah. So I didn't invite you because I wanted Kuwait. So I want you to be provocative. So thank you. So we have a couple of people who have raised their hands to ask questions. So starting with Ed. Go ahead, Ed.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your presentation and your discussion of the post-Western world that we're in. Our economics of models of consumption and white privilege and all that. The question I'd like to raise is, I wonder if fundamentally underlying all of this is that we need to be in a post-materialist world, that it's really that we're in this materialist paradigm, certainly the leaders and the institutions of the West, as you rightly critique, but also I'm wondering even in the East, in other words, with the rise of China, where we have the same thing in terms of a materialist perspective, or can we hope for transcending the materialist perspective? I've been working a lot on consciousness. How do we raise consciousness of our leaders? Any comments you have, I'd appreciate. Thank you.
No, thank you, sir. Ultimately, I've tried to stay out of consciousness and the realm of spirituality in discussions like this, because then, they all think you're Buddha or something. But you're absolutely right. It's such a critical aspect that most leaders don't have consciousness, and we need to develop that. So that's an area that I think that's where you all work, and that's why I suggested, tongue-in-cheek, that you have an important mission in the White House in Tel Aviv. Please send a delegation quickly. But But the point you make is absolutely right. We need to move to a post-material world, but there is a challenge. And I'm not here to advertise my books, but in my second book, I fundamentally address this question, and I'll take 2 minutes to describe the dilemma. If you look at the world's population today of 8 billion people, there are probably about 2 billion people who are what I call the consumption classes, the people who consume without purpose, who waste energy, and are essentially drinking Coke and eating useless hamburgers, etc., and consuming uselessly, and they're all over the world. But the majority, but they're very still a small segment of the population of the developing world. So if you look at Asia, population of 4.5 billion, I would suggest that perhaps 1 billion or a bit more than that fall into that category. So we still have, as we grow to about 6 billion in 30, 40 years, the potential for 4 or 5 billion of Asians to start to think that the only way to live the good life is to live the American dream or the European lifestyle, etc. This will be catastrophic. So, but we have now, and this is what I argued in my book, that we in this part of the world need to essentially have two things. One, the economic model of the Western paradigm. We have to abandon it. And second, we need to have political systems that allow us to do that. Because the Western democratic system, I don't think, will be able to live with the need to dematerialize, apart from some policies, but essentially lifestyles. Well, I'll give you an example, just as an extreme, but most of our cities in Asia are already, and I can say this because I come from this part of the world, pretty dumpy. And they are so large, so crowded. Today, India, and my Indian brothers and sisters will know, India has the largest amount of most polluted cities in the world. The automotive has taken it over. So most of our cities are so bad, so large, they need more cars like I need a hole in my head. But now who's going to take the cars off? It's got to be government policy. And so my point simply is this: we need draconian policies. And to do draconian policies, you need strong governments. Most democratic governments are weak. The transformations we need will need to put collective welfare above individual. All right. This is a longer discussion, but the short response is you're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. This is political objectives, and it redefines rights and freedoms. You do not have a right to a car. Now try saying that in Texas. Or anywhere in America. Yeah.
Yeah. Shakira, please go ahead.
Yes, good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure and a real honor to be here and to hear you, Dr. Nair. Is it Nair? Nair?
It's Nair. It's not doctor. It's just plain Mr.
Mr. Nair. Chandran.
Chandran is best.
Yes, thank you. So my question has to do with, I was very intrigued by your comment that you found, what was it? You said something like 1 million books written in a Tibetan library.
Yes.
I was flabbergasted by that, and it got me to thinking that Western society is so dominant that it will take an infusion of new thinking to really help us change. That said, and I agree with you, I think many Americans would agree with you that America is really one of it's the problem in the world. It's the problem child in the world. We are the youngest, very dominant civilization, and, we're just acting out. But the good news, I think, is that anyone can be an American, and we have Americans from all over the globe. Everyone who comes from another country here, your country person lives here as an American. And so there is the opportunity for us here in this country to kind of rein in those of us who are trying to be adults and trying to be good global citizens are trying to rein in the hegemony of what's happening here and what's happening in the White House in 1600 Pennsylvania and K Street in particular, because they seem to be driving things at this point, K Street and the Heritage Foundation. Anyway, it occurred to me that maybe we can find some use for AI before it kills us all. And that is that, do you have a thought about how AI might help us to translate some of that wisdom, for example, that lives in those Tibetan archives, and of course in the languages in Africa? I mean, I said at the beginning, I don't really know what my native language is. I'd love to know what it is. And so I'm just thinking that maybe there's space for AI to help us in that area.
That's a really interesting proposition. But thank you very much for your question. So yeah, it's the National Library in Mongolia. And Mongolia was, prior to the Soviet occupation, invasion, whatever you want to call it, expansion, was essentially predominantly Buddhist and Tibetan Buddhism. And if you go throughout the Tibetan world, both in China, large numbers of Buddhist temples, etc., and then through Tibet and through all that part, every Tibetan monastery has thousands and thousands of books, and they wrap them up in beautiful cloth, and they are stacked up as almost next to our idols, and people pray. So when someone showed me this basement, and I saw, and they told me there are 1 million books here, and to their credit, there's a small American organization trying to translate one book at a time. But this literature, as you said, needs to go out to the world. This literature includes, monks who sat in the middle of the Gobi Desert and wondered, what's the meaning of life? They wondered what's coming next. And they asked profound questions. 10 years ago, I sat with the Buddhist monk, and I said, so what do you think about the internet and the mobile phone? When it was beginning to permeate into the deepest parts of the ancient world in the Himalayas and all of that. And he said to me, and I still remember it, and my hair stood up on end. He said, we had a view in our books that the devil will come back. And he said, the internet is the devil incarnate because of the corruption of the mind. He was particularly talking about young people. So I do think, and I mean, you probably know more, but what a little I know about AI, it needs actually a repository of essentially language from which it can essentially decode and therefore bring it together. So I'm wondering if the scripture, the language can be scanned and AI could learn 500 books in 6 months, then it could possibly, as you say, maybe turn those books around in a year or so. It's a great idea, and if you don't mind, I'll steal it. I'll credit you for it, but I'll take it to someone and say, hey, why don't we put AI to some use? And this would be a great use. I hadn't thought about it. I had thought about AI creating robots that would essentially clean waterless toilets around the world. So thank you. Great idea. And yes, Americans need to, I think Americans need to call out your governments much more. And I've been asked this, we are doing everything we can. And I said, no, you're not. You're not revolutionary enough. You need to be revolutionary. It's too much cafe latte and the internet.
Let me say this. Calling someone an anti-Semite will lose you your job, your livelihood. That's why people are afraid to call it out. It's much more insidious than being a racist.
I know. And if you're interested, EK, I'm happy to share my article, which I wrote 3 weeks into the Gaza war. Even Asian public intellectuals have remained silent because they seek legitimacy in association with think tanks in the US, etc. I'm independent. I wrote a piece saying, you can't call me an anti-Semite. I have nothing against Jewish people. My history is no violence against Jewish people. You murdered Jewish people. Leave me out of this.
Yeah.
But I am going to call out the genocidal practices of the Israeli government. This one.
Please share your article.
I will.
Thank you. Shall we go to Jimmy? You're muted.
Thank you very much, Chandran. I enjoyed your talk. You said whether, or you asked whether someone is offended, and I would say I have taken offense to you're taking only two names, that is Gaza and Ukraine, and you have left out India. The conflict, it is not a war, it is not a conflict for outsiders, but those of us who believe in democracy and secularism, it is conflict and it is a war, but war of mind, war of ideology.
Yes.
Number one.
I totally agree. Yeah. I'm sorry I left it out because it could have a long list, but I totally agree.
Yeah.
So my apologies.
Yeah. Number two, you have mentioned about the West and East, and I agree to some extent, but that binary may not be always helpful. For example,
yes.
In India, before the colonials came in, the Varna and caste system existed. And I don't have to tell the audience here what the Varna caste system has done to India before the colonizers came here, and it is doing right now to India, and how the politics is using this divisive politics. Number two. Number three, I think also when we look at inclusion, I think we need to look at the 3 Ps, I call them. The populist governments in the world, where populism is 1 P, polarization is 2nd P, and post-truth is the 3rd P. And I think many of the governments, I'm emphasizing the word governments, it may not be the people. And therefore, a country like India, if you see, there is a mini US here, or mini US government here, or politics here. So as in America or as in Israel, you have the people and the government or regime, whatever you want to call it. In India, you have 10 or 20% of Indians who are like what you have said, the West here. And in Southwest India, I think India is doing exactly like what the American government is doing elsewhere in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jimmy, and you're totally right to correct me. But I hope you will understand that I couldn't list everything. So I listed what I thought at this stage was most contemporary. There are lots of other hidden horrors. And let me also say, to your point about me, I was not trying to pit West against East, but in terms of what I think global conflicts are, I think there's a real tension in the post-Western world, and that was what I was trying to address. And in my book, in my foreword of the book, which the book on dismantling global white privilege, in the foreword, I make a very clear statement. This book is addressing that particular issue. He's not suggesting for once that all the problems of the world come from Western hegemony. We have a great share of the blame to bear in our own countries and our own incompetence, our own. I come from Malaysia, and I fight relentlessly against the entrenched institutional, not systemic, racism, etc. We have to fight those, and you're right to point those out. And yes, the inclusion issue, I totally agree with you as well. My point was essentially at the geopolitical level, what we need to do. But your India examples and the many other countries where institutional weak governments, and I did mention that, I think, in terms of therefore what happens in countries is absolutely right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chandran. So we have one last question before we go into our breakout. So Vikas, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Shama. I've stored that name like that. Okay, it was lovely hearing you and listening to you, Mr. Nair. I wanted to understand from you, being an OD practitioner, we've been taught and I'm sure all of us have somewhere heard this whole dialogue around use of self. Okay, there is no solution you can devise without unless and until you are using all the solutions that you are giving, or even the speech that you gave was also kind of use of self. Okay, and that's how every solution differs. How different it is from the concept of advait, which is present in Indian way of thinking, advaita, if that's the way of looking at things. And we've been talking about advaita and use of self for, I think, uh, I think much before BC, or circa uh, 400 BC, maybe even prior to that. So what's your take on that?
I have to admit total ignorance, actually. So I have no idea about both of those two concepts. So I'll humbly admit. So I can't really respond to that. Perhaps you could just, for at least for my benefit, tell me a bit about both, and then maybe I could say, "Oh, I understand, but this is what I think." Would you mind?
Sure. So Advaita in Indian mythology, and if you read multiple subjects, or even we call it granths in
Mhm.
Sanskrit. So Advaita is a concept where the culmination of self and
Uh-huh.
anybody, so it's more from the inclusion lens, and the way we are taught use of self in any of the OD training or other aspects. How do you really use yourself to kind of devise any solution in India? We've been practicing it in our mythology, and the concept is advaita. Okay, which means
I see.
and we've been speaking about it maybe 1,000 years prior to even BC. So that's where, because like the hegemony of the Western, that they've started even speaking about or having conceptualized the whole
Yes,
use of
yeah,
self. This has been there in
for a
Indian
long time.
mythology, and
Yeah.
yeah, and even Buddhism has been is an extension to our thoughts, because if even Gautam
Yes.
Buddha was once upon a time Hindu prince, for that matter. Okay,
Yeah.
and it's a lot of it. What he has spoken is also an extension of how do we really look at ourselves. How do we really, of course, the death and after death and other philosophies are different. But I want to really kind of understand your bite in terms of use of
Yeah.
self per se.
Yeah. So I'm not schooled in this, these concepts like you are, but I do when you describe it in terms of what it means, I do understand it. The question really is, how alive is that in India today? How is it practiced? And if it's not, what is extinguishing it from day to day life? The other point I would make, which is related back to my earlier point, it's so interesting that, as you said, this goes back to thousands of years. The Chinese can also cite numerous philosophies, and of course, Islam too. All of this are not part of the mainstream discussion of elites like us. Most of us, our reference points are still the Western canon. So, how did this essentially come to bear? And as you said, then Westerners talk about this, and I think in a way you're saying, but we knew about this a long time ago, and that is essentially the story of so many things. And so I think we need to embrace the thinking from everywhere, but and rather be chauvinistic and say, hey, our cultures are better than yours, etc., which is that's not helpful. But what would be useful is to get this notion spread out. But the reason the Indian philosophies didn't get out is, of course, we know why. That the colonization of India, etc., the modernization, etc., Indian elites knew it in their own, but they were made to feel that this is not really that important. It's some Hindu mythology, spiritual nonsense. It's got no empirical evidence, etc. It doesn't have the rigor of Western thought. Let's keep it there and let's do some yoga. And when we talk get on the yoga mat, we can talk about it. But when we are talking about scholarly stuff, let the scholars talk about it. In mainstream, nobody knows. And I think the point you make is we have to mainstream these ideas from all cultures because they all existed and they're very powerful tools to be used. So that's kind of why. And in a way, it shows the commonality of human thought all over the world. They're coming from different cultures, but the commonality of human thought. And it's kind of what I'm interested in. What was the Tibetan monk or the monk sitting on a rock somewhere in the Himalayas thinking 300 years ago when they wrote a book? Were they thinking the same as someone else because we're all human beings, but they were driven by different experiences? I think that's really, I'm sure others have thought about this, even written about it, but it's an area that I think we will discover if we can translate and make more mainstream the philosophies and thinking from different cultures, which we don't seem to have, which is a great example is my own ignorance.
All right. Does that answer your question, Shama? Okay. So I think, yeah, I think,
Yes,
Chandran,
to a larger extent. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, not complete, but.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of the Western concepts that we have today, we have the same in our ancient philosophies, whether Chinese, Indian, Tibetan, and so on. It's just phrased in the different words, in a different context. That's all, right? All right. So thank you very much for all your questions. Right now, we would like to invite you to go into a breakout group to discuss on a couple of questions. So let me share the questions before we move in. All right. So the questions for you to contemplate is that based on what Chandran has shared, we are in a very polarized world today. So this is just taking different perspectives. What do you think of how do we compare against maybe, for example, 100 years ago or 200 years ago? Are we more or less polarized? All right. And the second question for you to think about is with respect to holding on to different perspectives. So what worldview am I holding on to? And what do I feel has influenced me to hold on to that worldview? All right, I will post these questions on the chat box as well. So if you can go into you can activate the breakout groups for you to go into your discussion for about 15 minutes. Thank you.
Organizers, you could change the Zoom setting so we can direct message each other. Currently, we can only message the whole group. Only hosts are able to direct.
Yeah, the Elvin, we will consider that. We will talk amongst ourselves. Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good discussion. So we have a couple more minutes for this session. Is there any other questions for Chandran? Or is there any group who we would like to share your insights, your learnings from your discussion? Please raise your hands. We have Ted. Go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, I am. I'm reflecting on what I've said, so I don't want to be too reactive, but I do have. I'm curious if you were to name one or two alternative narratives to the Western narrative that are emerging or present that I may not be aware of. That because as you talked, I said, well, I guess one in the Western term would be a totalitarian narrative about government. Exactly. So I'm curious to the kind of things that would be the alternatives that you're aware of that come to mind, those primary ones.
Thank you, Ted. I think, in my view, we are entering a phase in which the systems of governance in different countries are being developed in themselves. So alternatives exist. Clearly, there is a model in Japan which is democratic, but hardly Western in its entirety. And there are systems in the Western system as well, which are not necessarily the Anglo-Saxon model, which are different as well. But outside the West, I would say there are very different systems. Clearly, the most obvious different system is the Chinese system. And I would argue it's not a totalitarian system, but it's defined as totalitarian in the context of the Western way of looking at the world. And that's a larger conversation that can be had. There are systems of governance in the Middle East which are neither totalitarian necessarily, but smaller states like the UAE, but which do not follow necessarily the same more democratic principle, the democratic methods in the West. The problem I think we have is that we have elevated democracy to the sacred cow, and everything else is seen as something that is unsuited, that is repressive, that is authoritarian or totalitarian. And I don't think it's as simple as that at all. And that's essentially where the world is today, in terms of, I think, needing to understand different systems exist and are going to evolve. We're going to have to live with that because it's the only way forward, and accept differences in terms of systems, political systems, economic systems, and methods of governance.
So we have Elena and Lennox.
Thank you. You had mentioned there were 5 features, and I think I only captured 4. One was the population will peak or decline, climate change, capitalism was the 3rd, and the 4th was resource constraints. What was the 5th one?
Oh, I'm sorry, Elena. Yeah. So the 4 are the population peaking and declining, and that creates. The second was climate, which we all know about. The 3rd was the crisis of what we understand as today's capitalism, which is born out of relentless consumption. The 4th is actually what I call the overreach of technology.
I remember hearing that. I just didn't capture it. Thank you.
And by technology, I don't just mean digital. It's a trick question. When I run programs with young people, I said, so what do you think is the most important technology going forward?
I see.
And if they're 30 years, anyone under 30, it's typically something to do with the internet, it's something to do with digital, it's something to do with AI. And I point out to them, in the post-COVID world, the most important technology going forward will be water supply and sanitation. 80% of the world does not have access to that. And that is very high-end technology too. So that's the 4th, and then
Great.
the 5th of resource constraints.
And again, you're taking away Shakira's brilliant idea. So
yes, I'm going to take that away and try and share it and see if someone can do something.
And
with
she's
it.
Okay with it. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Elena. I think one last question from Lennox.
Thank you very much, Ike. Chandran, this is probably going to be a very intrusive question, but I am totally intrigued with your lapel pin, and I'm wondering what's the significance of it.
All right, Lennox, can I ask an intrusive question before I reply? Where are you from?
I'm originally from the Caribbean, from Trinidad and Tobago. I live in Brussels.
I thought I detected a Bajan accent, but I would be very wrong, but close enough, I suppose.
Yes.
Okay. No, thank you for noticing. It's actually my lapel is essentially I have several of them, and it's essentially something I wear, which is turquoise stones from Tibet, framed in a I suppose a cheap gold wiring, or no, not wiring. It's actually a gold, what do you call it? Strap of sorts. Yeah, but the stones are Tibetan turquoise.
Right. Would you mind sharing the significance for you?
I have very good friends in Tibet, in China, etc., and I admire their culture, and I've got to understand the importance of stones in their culture. And for those of you who are interested, the most sacred stone in the Tibetan culture is a stone called the Zer, or the sky stone. And so maybe some of those from India might know, but in the mountainous areas of Central Asia, particularly in Tibet, Nepal, etc., and in parts of China and Sichuan, etc., is the sky stone. And the origins of the stone are very mysterious. You can go and Google it. It's DZE. And the original stones go back hundreds of years, and they actually have a very strange history in mythology. But then, because they were seen as bringing good luck, the Taiwanese in the 50s started to make them using laser from stones, because they have a design which is natural, and you can't find enough of those. And there are stones that have what they call 2 eyes, 3 eyes, and even 6 eyes. And some of them can cost $500,000 today. I don't have any of those, by the way, just saying. But yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that external manifestation of your value system. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. We are at time, so we will not be able to accommodate any more questions.
She's got one. She's got a Zer. Okay.
Oh, cool.
Okay.
Thanks for sharing, Shakira. Yeah.
If you give me a
thank you
second,
so much.
I'll show you a true one as well. If you give me a second, give me a second.
Iki, I didn't mean to carry us off this way.
No worries, next.
That's a Zer from Tibet.
Mm.
Thank you.
And you can tell the authenticity and age by the patina. So it's a very learned thing, but over time you get to know. But there are those that are now made to lasers, but the original ones are very hard to find. But if you go to the villages in Tibet and China, you'll find poor people carrying some of these, wearing them around. No one steals them off them. They could be wearing a stone that's worth $50,000 up in the mountains.
All right. Thank you so much for sparing your time for us, Chandran. I really appreciate this.
My pleasure.
I think your
Can I just say,
been...
EK, that I shared some views that I understand may have troubled a few people, but I said that's in the spirit of sharing. I'm really sorry if I offended anybody, but it was the spirit of sharing, and I hope we learn from all of these things. So thank you for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much.